Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech protected.
Everybody here to this talk here at the Rockingham Public Library on a chilly Wednesday, January 17th, 2024. And the purpose of this talk is to discuss different scenarios that happened involving American POWs after the end of the Vietnam War in 1973. The end officially really didn't come until 75 when Saigon fell to the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese in a multi-month campaign where they took the interior and then worked their way towards the coast. Anyway, I use this as a thumbnail for the talk. It's an aerial photograph taken by an S-71 high-altitude plane that is used for spy purposes. Takes pictures of what it flies over. And what you see here in crude letters, okay,
Oh, you can't step too close to it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. USA, and underneath, can you see what letter that might be? What letter do you think that might be underneath the USA? It's kind of a broken what?
Like a K.
It's a K. It's a broken K, but it's actually intentional. It's what's called a walking K. In the walking K, you can kind of see the two legs underneath. Again, it's very crude. This is a rough photograph.
If you knew what a walking K was.
Yeah, walking K is a distress signal used by pilots in the United States Air Force. Sometimes you will see the K in Morse code. Da-da-da, a dash, a dot, a dash on the roof of a building, a prison building. That is also a distress signal, K. Here I am, I need help. I'm being held against my will. I'm a U.S. Air Force pilot. So that's what this is. And this picture was taken in 1988, which is noteworthy because all of the American POWs supposedly came back in 1973 in Operation Homecoming. Some 591 American POWs came back. Unfortunately, and this is in the press release as well, the CIA, Department of Defense, have confirmed that the North Vietnamese were holding at least 1,200 American POWs. So you have 1,200. This was also confirmed by a communique that was intercepted between Hanoi and Moscow because the two governments worked closely together, confirming that they were holding 1,207 American POWs in 1972, the year before. So what happened to the other 600 that were not released? Also, this war was in 3 different countries. To further complicate matters. All right. You have China in the top there. You have North Vietnam, which shares a border with China. China supported the North Vietnamese. In fact, the leader of the North Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, had met at least once or twice with Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. You see Laos, which is the country to the left, and down below you see Cambodia. That red arrow that you see that branches off, that is called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the major supply line for the communist troops, or the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, to bring weapons, personnel, food, whatever the army needed in its invasion of South Vietnam. There we go. So you can see that Laos was involved in the war, Cambodia was involved in the war. They also held American POWs, because American POWs were also shot down as pilots or air crew over Cambodian airspace, over Lao airspace. Again, the government estimates, our government estimates that there were 300, roughly 300 American POWs being held in Laos after the fall of Saigon, when we were supposedly out of it. And we were for all official purposes. Cambodia, 100, roughly 100 American POWs were held after the end of the war. So if you do the math, that's roughly 600 held in Vietnam, 300 held in Laos, and 100 in Cambodia. That's 1,000 men, 1,000 personnel that were left behind. Most of them were flight crew, or they were pilots. And I found this interesting. There was a general that wrote an opinion piece that appeared 20, 30 years ago. And he said that the loss of 1,000 aircraft, because during the Vietnam War, which ran from 64 to 73, we lost 1,000 aircraft. In other words, we flew aircraft over North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and surface-to-air missiles, or sometimes just 50 caliber machine guns, would take these aircraft down. We lost 1,000, which means we lost 1,000 crew sets. And this general, I don't remember his name, he said a lot of that could have been avoided by having the Navy offshore pounding targets with their guns. In other words, it was questionable military strategy to send in individual aircrafts to hit targets when you had long-range guns on Navy vessels that were capable of reaching these targets. So, again, it's like fighting a fight with one hand behind your back. It was a big disadvantage, and we lost 1,000 aircraft. All right, we're going to talk tonight briefly 2 stories. Originally, I had thought of 4 stories, but I'm going to save the other 2 stories, which involve POW activity in Laos, for the next time we meet, hopefully during a warmer night. We're going to deal with 2 stories. The first story is about a person who deserted or went AWOL, away without leave. And the second story is about 2 gentlemen that supposedly perished in downed aircraft, but miraculously appeared 10 years later looking for asylum. So those 2 stories we're going to look at. First story. Let's go to. Hi. I mentioned the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This is how the Ho Chi Minh Trail was maintained in the wake of constant air attacks. Constant air attacks. You see the young lady there, the cart, all the people there, North Vietnamese or sympathizers. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was gravel. It did a lot of winding because you could see it's mountainous territory. It was the lifeline of supplies coming to the south. Not only were the North Vietnamese active there, but you also had other communist countries like Cuba that sent people to help not just maintain the highway. It's not really a highway, it's a trail. Maintain the trail. You could drive a truck down it, maybe two abreast if they were close. Of course you had to drive trucks. How else are you going to move material? But you're not going to move material in a little cart. But this was the extent that these people were going to. You see another cart on the right to maintain this road so that supplies could go through. They also had, besides Cubans, you had people from East Germany, another communist country, helping out the North Vietnamese. Again, these were all part of a family, Soviet Union and China, that worked with the North Vietnamese. Okay. So, whoops, here we go. That's Ho Chi Minh Trail today. It's a tourist attraction. You see a fellow motorbiking? It's a great trail system. It goes for hundreds of miles. Look at the terrain, mountainous, motorbike. People bike, off-road vehicles. What is that on the left? Hey. Bryce, what do you think that is?
Tank.
Yeah, it's a tank. Does it look like a tank?
No.
That's because the turret's gone, right? The turret with the cannon is missing. But anyway, you see, it's like two different cultures. Recreation and war. Anyway, you can visit the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You can travel along it today as a tourist. All right. This is Army SP4, Specialist 4, McKinley Nolan Infantry, Army Infantry, from Washington on the Brazos in Texas, small town. He had a 2-year stint. If you were drafted, you spent 2 years in the service, okay? And he was in infantry. He was stationed in hope to say this right, Tai Ninh. Tai Ninh is northwest of Saigon near Cambodia. You see Saigon, capital of South Vietnam. You look to the left, you see Cambodia. We had a base there. He was stationed there. He was near the end of his 2-year hitch when he decided in September of 1967 to go AWOL. Again, that's leaving your post without permission. He was gone for 2 months. He was gone until early November 1967. I don't have proof, that's why I'm saying I don't have proof, but I believe that it was during this 2-month period of time that he found a wife. He must have gone into Cambodia, or there was some back and forth, Vietnamese and Cambodia, Cambodians or Khmer, they were called Khmer people in Vietnam, but he met a Khmer woman, obviously fell in love, and they were together. Eventually they would have a son. He came back, he was put in the brig, which is a jail, for 2 days. And then either he was released, we're talking middle of November, he was released or he escaped. And he wasn't heard of again. Gets interesting now. All right, these are the 2 people he left behind in Texas. You see his picture being held by his wife, his American wife, Mary Nolan. And that gentleman on the right, that's his son. He left behind a wife and a son. His son's name is Roger. This picture was taken about 2009 for a Seattle Times newspaper article on McKinley Nolan and the Nolan family. All right. The North Vietnamese, as well as the Americans, were very good at propaganda. Propaganda is just a way of trying to convince the other side to give up, to voluntarily lay down their arms and stop fighting. Now, the North Vietnamese were not dumb people. They realized that there were racial tensions in America. We're talking 1967, 1968. Martin Luther King is still alive. A lot of tension in not just cities, but rural areas as well. And so they picked up on this, the North Vietnamese, and they specifically targeted Black soldiers, Black airmen, for efforts to get them to stop fighting. This is what is called a blank space. That's called a leaflet. You print up your message on a leaflet, both sides. Sometimes you have a cartoon or a drawing. Sometimes you have someone's picture. And you print it by the thousands. In fact, you stack them this high, or that many. And then if you have the resources, you have a plane, you throw them out the plane, they scatter with the wind. Or like the North Vietnamese would do, they would paint signs with these messages and put the signs where the new American infantry would go by. Got to remember, this is very dense vegetation. This is jungles. You're not out in the open. Many times you're in the woods or the jungle. You can't see if somebody is 10 feet away, 15 feet away, because they're hidden by foliage. All right? Or they're in the water. They have they're in a swampy area. They're camouflage. Well, these messages would go out, and they were addressed to U.S. Negro Army men. All right? We didn't say blacks when at that time the term Negro was used. And it would say stuff like, here it says, stop the U.S. war-like policy. Blood of American and Vietnamese youth have been shed too much. Don't die for the benefit of U.S. warlords and their lackeys in South Vietnam. All right, messages like that. Let's continue. Here's a cartoon that was also on a leaflet. This was produced in North Vietnam, and it shows Black soldiers with their helmets. It says USA. And then there's a white sergeant who says, back home in the United States, Negroes are at the end of the line. But here in Vietnam, it's different. We put you right up front. You have to remember that the infantry, most people did not want to be in the infantry. Most people refused to go into the, not most, but some people refused to go into the service, or they tried to get into another branch of the service. You have infantry here. Roughly 30% of the American infantry in Vietnam was Black. So it would make sense that the North Vietnamese would target these 30% of the infantry and use the issue of race and how they were treated in the United States as a wedge to get them to, why are you fighting us? We're not hurting you. Okay, so this was a leaflet. Now, the reason I bring up these leaflets is McKinley Nolan helped with making these leaflets. He was not a writer, but he was an artist. It's quite possible that he drew this. There were other Americans that were also doing similar work, former military that had been captured or deserted, went away without leave, that were also helping the North Vietnamese with artwork or with translations of what they wanted to say. Most Vietnamese do not know English. Officials do not necessarily know English, so they need somebody with a good command, native speaker of American English to make these leaflets believable, interesting. All right, guess who this is? First name begins with M, last name begins with N, as in Nolan. That's McKinley Nolan. Let's see. You see the resemblance, kind of? That's his army picture. By the way, I need to say this as well. Before he went away without leave, before McKinley went AWOL, he had a combat medal, and he also had earned himself a Purple Heart in combat. Something else you should know, he would write his wife Mary back in Texas saying, I can't stand this anymore. I have to play dead in the battleground and hopefully not be shot. He says, all I see is killing. I can't take it anymore. Slaughter. I mean, one of those things, it's hard to imagine if you're not there. Anyway, there he is. This is a letter that he wrote to his fellow infantrymen. It says here at the top, Rally Man Nolan, because that's his last name. Rally Man. When you rally, that means you change sides. When we speak of rally in American English, rally for the troops means we support. But there's another meaning for rally that the North Vietnamese used, probably not knowing that it would be misunderstood, and that would be to rally, go to the other side. So they're saying he went to the other side, which he did. It says, rally Man Nolan to the 25th, the 1st and 25th Infantry. And it's basically saying, I think we have it written here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It just says, I'm proud to have the pleasure to write and tell you why on November 12, 1967, I crossed over to the South Vietnam National Liberation Front. That was a communist group that was working within South Vietnam to bring about change, to bring about the fall of the American-backed South Vietnamese government. He says, after nearly 2 years in South Vietnam, I see that the war in Vietnam waged by the Johnson government, Lyndon Baines Johnson was the president in the mid-60s at that time, only brings harm to the lives and property of the Vietnamese and American people. I do not intend to let you add more crimes on the peace and freedom loving Vietnamese people and try to prevent my friends from dying useless death. He didn't like this. I think he was coached, and part of the reason was for better treatment. And they took a picture of him to put on this leaflet. And these leaflets were distributed in the air, or they were left along the trail where the new infantry would walk or patrol. Okay. Basically, it's interesting because he doesn't bring up race in this. A black man fighting what many saw as a white man's war. He didn't bring it. Which was interesting because there are a lot of leaflets where race is brought up, as in that picture that we saw before, the cartoon. All right, so this was kind of an interesting meeting. Let me tell you who we're looking at. First of all, this is in a Cambodian village not far from Vietnam. This picture was taken in 2008, many, many years later. This fellow here, let me make sure I get his name right. Dan Smith. Thank you. Dan Smith is a veteran, Vietnam War veteran, who for about 10 years had been bringing medicine over to Vietnam and Cambodia on his own. He would raise money, pay for medicine that he knew was needed over in Vietnam and in Cambodia, and make a yearly trip. Well, he ran into somebody, rather tall black man, in a Cambodian village where he was delivering the medicine. And they were talking very briefly. And the tall black man, his eyes were yellow, his teeth were rotten. He looked like he was about 60 years old. So who do you think it might be? McKinley Nolan. But wait, it's not that simple. The man then says, I wish I could go home. And then the veteran, Dan Smith, who was delivering the medicine, say, why can't you go home? He says, well, I'm in kind of an odd situation. And he says, where are you from? And he said, Washington, Texas. So he gets curious as to who the hell he was talking with. He comes back to the United States. He gets in touch with the McKinley family in Washington on the Brazos, with Mary, his wife, with Roger, his son, and he describes the man he had an encounter with, also briefly. And he became convinced that that fellow, whoever he was, had assumed the identity of McKinley Nolan. He stole his identity. Talk about identity theft. Digital identity theft. This was identity theft in war. But he was intrigued. He says, I want to find out what happened to the real McKinley Nolan. So he goes over, he meets with that gentleman in the center with the gray hair. That gentleman is a village elder in this village in southern Cambodia. His name is Cham Son, Chanson. And he goes there with the brother, who's in the next slide, of McKinley. McKinley's brother's name is Michael. There they are. It's Michael Nolan on the left. There's Chanson, the village elder. He's kind of like a wise man. He helps make decisions in the village. That's Dan Smith on the left, and probably an interpreter in the middle, because they're obviously speaking Cambodian. And lo and behold, Chanson says, yes, I remember this black American. He was in our village in the 70s. He had a Khmer wife, Cambodian wife, and they had a son. He worked in the local coffee plantation. Evidently, they grow coffee in Cambodia. I didn't know that. And he drove a truck. And he was fine there until Pol Pot came to power in Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, and started what would be called the killing fields. Now, Pol Pot was I'm going to say, he was a Marxist. He followed the Marxist doctrine. He was an ideologue. In other words, he just believed in a theory. He believed more in the theory than he did in humans. He put Cambodia on an agricultural, what they call year zero ground level. In other words, he rolled back the clock 2,000 years. And he says, we're going to be an agrarian society. So what he did was he emptied Phnom Penh, which is the capital, and other cities in Cambodia, and he sent all the teachers, doctors, the lawyers, anybody with a profession, he sent out to work in the fields. And if they didn't like it, what do you think he did with them? He sent them to a re-education camp. Re-education camp were the killing fields. So, how do you think this new regime that took over in 1975 in Cambodia, how do you think it would react to an American being married to a Khmer woman and having a son? He would stand out as a tall black man, good build. In fact, Cham Sun told Michael, the brother, and Dan Smith. There was also a journalist that covered the story, Lynette. What was his? Richard Lynette. Sorry, I don't remember all the names. And he said that, yeah, McKinley was very kind. He helped out. He actually learned Pidgin Cambodian. And because he was so big and strong, they put him, this is the Khmer soldiers, Pol Pot soldiers. They put him to work pulling an ox cart. And what was in the ox cart? Villagers that were on their way to an interrogation center. This is how widespread, how deep, how prevalent this iron grip of terror was. And the story, again from Cham Sun, was that in his Pidgin Cambodian, as he was pulling this cart with villagers on it to an interrogation center, he would tell jokes and sing folk songs that he had learned, Cambodian folk songs. I don't have any reason not to believe it's true. It's not true. I mean, why would the man make something like that up? You probably can guess what happened. A number of times, the Khmer soldiers would come into a village and start beating people they didn't like the looks of, or people who didn't have a name or didn't have any power in this new government. And often McKinley would stand with his stature, his imposing height because these are smaller people. Okay? Between the threatening soldier and the villager that could get a beating. So this happened a number of times until one day in 77, according to Cham Sun, they came for him. And he wordlessly went with them because he knew that this was it, after saying goodbye to his wife and his boy, and he was never seen again. He was most likely executed. So, is there? Yeah. And interestingly enough, of all newspapers, I don't know why, but the Seattle Times in March of 2009, a year after this interview with Cham Sun, published the story of McKinley Nolan, and was the only newspaper I found that carried the story with the photographs. Interesting. Any questions or comments before we move on to the second Yellow story?
So this gentleman's son, he was part of the.
This was, McKinley's brother, Michael.
Oh, yes, the gentleman on the right, is the, Cambodian that was part of the Khmer Rouge, wasn't he?
He was a village elder. He wasn't an official Khmer Rouge. He wasn't a soldier. He was in the village at the time. You gotta remember, he's what, 60 here, maybe 65. In 76, 77, he would be what, in his 20s? Okay.
Time.
So he was just a villager. All right, that's Chamsun, right?
Yep.
Sorry, that was Chamsun on the right. I believe that grinning gentleman in the back, the young man, he's the interpreter. That fellow there is Dan Smith in the middle with the purple shirt. He's the Vietnam vet that brought medicine over on a yearly basis. And again, this is Michael McKinley's brother. The son, for some reason, did not come, nor did the wife. Sure. Thanks for asking for clarification. Okay. All right. One last word about leaflets. In the late 80s, there was a tactic. I shouldn't use the word tactic. There was an approach towards getting POWs rescued called the reward leaflets. If you look at the cartoon, this cartoon is replicated on both sides of the paper. On one side, the cartoon is written in Lao, and on the back side, the cartoon, the text is in Vietnamese. Look at the, I can't get close, obviously, but look at, you see the American POW, and you see the Prophet Lao, because we're talking about a different country, not in Cambodia anymore. We are in Laos, north of Cambodia, above Cambodia, Laos, very long country. And again, we had maybe 300 people that were held in captivity there after the war. So you have the armed guard with the Laotian flag. That's a sun in the middle. Pathet Lao was the name of the government, so it would be a Pathet Lao soldier. And then you see the American flag, the tall American, that is in handcuffs, shackles. Now you see the Pathet Lao guard sleeping, and while the guard is sleeping, a friendly native, Lao, takes the American captive away from the camp, wherever they are, and brings him from Laos to that flag on the left. That's Thailand. You see the boat. See, a lot of people in Vietnam at the time and in Laos do not read. They do not read, they speak. They can also understand a cartoon. Cartoons resonate with many more people. And so what happens? The American has something gold and he's handing it to the Lao countrymen that helped free the American. Anybody take a guess how much the reward was if you were successful in freeing an American POW and getting him to Laos or some neutral country? Any idea the monetary amount? $10,000, $1,000, $1 million. What would be the reward offered? What's that?
Food.
Food, okay. Maybe a trip to Vermont. I'm sure, although I think he probably likes South Carolina better. Hawaii. Hawaii. Ah, I love that, Hawaii.
What was it? What was the monetary?
$100,000. If you were successful, this gentleman right here, successful in bringing an American from captivity into freedom, your reward was 100,000. Now, I'm not saying the government paid the 100,000. I think this was a private MIA POW organization that said, look, we'll give somebody $100,000 if they can successfully bring somebody over.
How much would that be in like US dollars today?
I'd say 500,000, wouldn't you? We're talking, well, 1988, let's say 400,000. Inflation hasn't been that high.
In Laos is probably, 10 million.
Laos, you could buy a province probably. You start your own army. I shouldn't joke about that, but. So, anyway, anybody want to guess how often this worked? What the results were? Was anybody free? We will never know, and there's a good reason why. These people were anonymous. The ones that helped, their identity was maintained secret. It was like a protective witness program in a, in a crime family situation. You help us, we will put you in a safe house and take care of you the rest of your life under another identity. Okay? Something similar to that here. You got your $100,000. You didn't want to tell anybody. Your government didn't find out about it. The Pathet Lao government. So, interesting. So we'll never know how many people were released, because even if the American who was released, he wouldn't tell anybody. He would probably try to pick up his life as quietly as possible in some place where he wouldn't be stand out. I'm guessing. All right. On to our second and the other situation we're going to look at. All right, Marine pilot flying the Navy A4. His name is Walter Schmidt from Valley Street, Long Island. No, somewhere in Nassau County. Maybe Valley Street. And in summer of '68, he's flying his plane. There he is, flying his plane. And he's flying along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Why is he flying along the Ho Chi Minh Trail?
Because that's where they guarded that trail or something like that.
Right, because what do they use that trail for?
Supplies, and maybe like they just took it over or something.
Exactly, they use it to bring down supplies from the north. Supplies from China, supplies from North Vietnam. Okay? So he's strafing. This was the summer of '68. He's strafing or machine gunning because you have cannons on these aircraft. Whoops. And he's strafing the truck column that's along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What do you think happens to him? There's two of them. He's got a wingman. There's two aircraft. They're flying together. They see this truck column along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It's serpentating around because it's not like I-91. It's not straight. It's like this. It's like a snake. And it's hidden by foliage, right? We're in jungle country. So they're strafing it. What do you think somebody does?
Shoot down a plane.
Surface to air missile hits this. And Walter Schmidt is going down. He's radioing to his wingman, I'm going down, I'm hit. Wingman radios back to their base. the base sends out a helicopter to rescue Walter Schmidt. Because Walter Schmidt, his plane crashes, but before it crashes, he's got a parachute and he ejects. He comes down. What do you think is waiting for him?
The people who travel there.
They're not far away. He's able to radio to the other plane, his wingman. I'm on the ground. I think my leg is broken. And I know they're coming towards me. I can hear voices. Pretty scary, huh? And the night is coming down. The helicopter arrived to try to pick him up, but there was so much ground fire, the helicopter couldn't safely pick him up. The helicopter went back to its base. He was left there. The next day, we're able to get Americans to look for him at the crash, near the crash site. He's gone, his parachute is gone. What happened? He became a POW. They picked him up. And there's a confirmation. One of the best sources of information are people who defect, people who rally and go to the other side. We were fortunate to have a lot of North Vietnamese or Viet Cong officers that defected to the south, and they had lots of good information for us. One of these officers that defected to the south, and we interviewed, told of a person very closely resembling Walter Schmidt a week after the crash being held prisoner about 4 miles away along the Ho Chi Minh Trail where he had just strafed. And that's the last we hear of him until 1979. Now, there's two people in this story. That's Walter Schmidt. Want to meet the other guy? Okay,
Yes.
there he is. Todd Melton from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, Todd and I have something in common, and it's not family related. We had the same task in the military. He was a spook. I was a spook. A spook is somebody who spies and listens in on other people. Normally, you use a radio. You listen to the communications in whatever language it is, because you've learned enough of that language to pick up key military words. All right? That's what Todd did. And he knew Lao, because this is where he was flying over, also knew some Vietnamese. And he knew how to master this radio equipment and also radio direction finding equipment to find out where the transmitter is that the person was using for the communication. You want to see what plane he was in? Okay.
Was he the wingman?
He was an Air Force, they called them systems operator. And what was his rank? He was a staff sergeant in the Air Force. Staff sergeant. Todd Melton. All right. Now, in February of 1973, now that date is important because the war had officially ended. 2 days earlier, early February 1973, Henry Kissinger, who represented us at the negotiation table with the North Vietnamese, he bartered a peace deal with the North Vietnamese. Both sides signed it, so there were no more hostilities. But this was a spy plane. And many people would say it broke the truce right away. It broke the peace agreement because the peace agreement said, no, you're not going to be spying on us anymore. But Todd was part of an 8-man crew. Whoops. Well, anyway, that's another picture of Todd Melton relaxing. There's Todd right there, sitting down on the bench. This was Da Nang. This was another group he was working with. Here we go. This is an EC-47 called the Baron 52 aircraft. There's a crew of 8. You have 4 flight crew that keep this thing in the air, land it, take it off, that sort of thing. In the back here is where all the electronic equipment is for snooping on people, listening in, finding out where they are through radio direction finding. All the equipment was back there, and there were 4 technicians, 4 spooks, including Todd, that were working. They flew over southern Laos, February 5th, 1973, listening. Very secret. What do you think happened?
They were shot down.
Surface-to-air missile hit them. The plane went down. Interestingly enough, all 4 crew, the regular crew of the aircraft, all died upon impact. None of these guys parachuted. They all went down with the plane. Whoa. Miraculously, the 4 spooks, or systems analysts, technicians that were listening, they survived. Not only did they survive, but they were able to move and walk around. What do you think happened to them? Again, right, Bryce? They were shot down. Somebody knows that they came down.
They were captured.
They were captured. Interestingly enough, a source for RCIA, Central Intelligence Agency, reported that a communication was picked up by Pathet Lao radio, reporting to Hanoi that they had 4 Americans that they were bringing to Hanoi for interrogation. Todd was one of them. Not only that, but our government knew that their trip wasn't going to end in Hanoi. They were going to be transferred and sent up for interrogation where? Close, the other side.
Ruski?
The Ruskies. Moscow.
Yes.
Yeah, Russia. The 4 of them, and I'll bet money on this, because think of it, they have state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. If you were the enemy, wouldn't you want to know all about it? In fact, the people, there was a guy that, when I was reading this account, there was an analyst for the CIA who said it would have been better if they all died. If they all died, none of them could betray us. That was the attitude. Or another analyst or another official would say, I hope they kill themselves before the Russians, before the Soviets can get any information out of them about our equipment. But interestingly enough, they survived, but all the equipment on the plane was burnt, was useless, was not salvageable. Whoever went through the wreckage could not get any information, any intel, tech intel out of the equipment because it was fried, burnt. All right. Story shifts. We don't know what happened to these guys until November 1979. Now you've got 2 people in very different areas. You got one person, one of 4, shot down in southern Laos. I got it. You have another person shot down west of Kew. Kew is a city about halfway up, right around there. Okay? Both these guys appear later in November of '79. They're emaciated. In other words, they're very thin. They look very worn. They're definitely Americans. They're tall. They're Caucasian. They wind up going to a sawmill in northern Vietnam not far from the Chinese border. And this sawmill is run by the Swedish government as a foreign aid or foreign development project. This is 1979, 4 years after the war's ended. Neutral countries like Sweden are starting to set up development projects. A lot of forest area in northern Vietnam. So they have a paper mill. These two guys, Todd Melton from Laos and Walter Schmidt, west of Hugh, they turn up. They manage somehow to escape the work detail in the forest where they've been forced to live. They wind up inside the Swedish compound of this paper mill, and they say, we want political asylum. We're American POWs. So the Swedish manager of the paper mill, gives them fresh clothes, gives them something to eat. And he says, you guys stay here. I need to consult with our embassy. And so while the consulting is going on, there's a German engineer who's also working at this paper mill. He's in charge of installing new machinery because they take the logs, the wood, and they turn it into paper. That's what this mill does. And he says, you guys are American, huh? They tell him his name. They tell the German engineer their names. I'm Todd Melton. This is my serial number. I'm Walter Schmidt. Now, was this two people assuming the identity of two others? Doubtful. Where would they get those two names? Well, you probably can guess what the Swedish embassy decided to do. To avoid a diplomatic incident, to avoid embarrassing their hosts, the Vietnamese, because they're 1979, they're Vietnamese, they're not North, they're not South. The Swedish embassy elects to return the two men to the Vietnamese. Return them to the work detail. And that's the last we hear of Todd Melton. And that's the last we hear of Walter Schmidt. I have no proof, but I have a feeling that both men were put in a situation where they couldn't escape and be not just an embarrassment. This works a couple of ways around. Not only an embarrassment for the Vietnamese, but an embarrassment for the American government that would have to admit that, yes, we still have Americans in captivity in Southeast Asia. And no, we have no plans of getting them back. So it was an embarrassment. It was embarrassing. So I think the American government was consulted with this. Again, I have no proof, but I would bet money on it. It's logical. Swedish government, obviously. The Vietnamese government. And in 79, they decided it was better just to keep this covered up and return the two. So, icing on the cake is coming. Well, that's a matter of speaking. All right. This is a picture of one area of the paper mill. You can see that there's hills. The hills are covered with pine trees, spruce, etc. Very rich in forest. I like this picture, except I don't like that in your face. Two young ladies, there's a roll of paper, like for newspaper, magazines, that was made at the mill out of logs, and they're smiling. They're grateful to be working and having some type of living wage. This is a Swedish gentleman associated with the project who is chipping in and cutting a few logs while the Vietnamese workers who do this ad nauseum every day look on, perhaps amused, perhaps not. And then perhaps that's his wife or somebody else, the lady on the left. All right. This is what happened, according to the U.S. Air Force. All 8 men perished in the crash of the B-52. Not 4, but all 8. The regular flight crew and the 4 in the 4 techs. You see Todd Milton, Peter Cressman, Dale Brandenburg, and Joe Matajov. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing the name. So they were all lumped together. What brought this about? Well, in '96, a forensics team went to the crash site and started sifting through the remains, and officially came to the conclusion that the remains contained the remains had the last, what's the word? Through DNA, they identified all 8 members of the crew. Now, this is in direct contrast to the 2 gentlemen showing up at the mill asking for. But if you're looking at the official line of how to resolve this potentially embarrassing apparition of 2 American POWs in the Swedish paper mill, this is how you do it. Crash site forensics exam came to the conclusion that all 8 had died there upon the crash, when the plane crashed. They're all their remains, or their supposed remains, were put into a group burial plot. And this is the stone above the plot. It has the names of all 8, the 4 crewmen, the 4 techs, and there's Todd Milton's name on the right-hand side. Now, the family of Joseph Matajov, I believe he's from Long Island, did not buy the official result. They said, our son is still alive. We have outside reliable evidence that he was sighted, and the Air Force said, no, it couldn't be him. His remains are at this crash site. This case is closed. So,
Was he a crew or tech?
he was part of the crew. He worked with Todd Melton. He survived the crash along with Todd Melton and 2 others. Dave, what's his name? Where's Peter Cressman survived, and so did, come on, why am I not? Dale Brandon. All 4 techs survived. Remember, a radio communication was intercepted detailing the transfer of these 4 prisoners from Laos to Hanoi in North Vietnam. So, you've got 2 different stories here, the official version and the version that's backed up by evidence. Radio communication evidence, and also this gentleman, one of these 2 POWs, identified himself as Todd Melton at the Swedish sawmill in 1979. Over 5 years after the crash. I'm assuming that they had been interrogated and then they were returned south. At least they hadn't been killed as hell. This is just a shot of the cemetery. If you look at the flag on the right, you can guess what state we're in. Anybody want to guess? The flag on the right has a checkered pattern. That's Maryland. This is in Maryland. And then you see, I took this picture actually at the cemetery. Yeah, the American flag and underneath the POW flag. And so this is where we're going to finish up these two stories. And sometime in the spring, when it's warmer outside, we'll have two other stories. One story about two attempts to get the release of POWs in Laos. One was through humanitarian aid, okay, which showed great promise of cooperation from the Lao officials in releasing POWs because we were giving them hospital supplies that they desperately needed. So it was a humanitarian gesture. That was one attempt. The other attempt was a raid that was a joint Delta Force CIA operation that fell apart because the CIA half failed in their mission. And that's not my judgment. When we go through the story, you will see that the CIA side of the recon group fell short of its objectives. So that's what we'll talk about next time. Any questions? All right, well, I hope that spurred some interest. I just find this kind of interesting, these individual stories of people that have just been officially just erased, so to speak. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. And there'll be a press release and I have your email addresses. I'll let you know when we do that talk about the two Laos initiatives to free Americans. Both of them were roughly the same period of time, 1981, under the Reagan administration.